قالنا أغصر النور وأفل نزغ جغوب فل نزغ جغوب وشيلا عند أغل أرويح جمود هذا السير لنز جمود هذا السير.
Welcome to The Explainer. You know those objects you see in a museum, behind the glass, under perfect lighting? Well, today we're going to unlock their secret lives, the stories that you'll never see on a label. We're talking about the wild, complex journeys these things took long before they became artifacts. And to kick things off, let's start with a bit of a mystery. See this heavy metal bracelet? And these amazing carved wooden posts. They look beautiful, right? But they're kind of silent. Well, I'm here to tell you their real stories are anything but.
So you might think our story starts in, I don't know, the deserts of the Sahel or somewhere far away. But actually, it starts somewhere much quieter. We're in the climate-controlled halls of the Spencer Museum of Art, right at the University of Kansas. This is where these objects live now.
So there they are, behind the glass with a little label that probably just says Tuareg art. We look at them and think, oh, that's a cool aesthetic artifact, something frozen in time. But for the people who actually made and used them, these things weren't just art. No way. They were a living, breathing part of their everyday life, their beliefs, their survival. All right, so let's get into it. To really get what these objects are all about, we can't hang around the museum. We got to go back in time. We're heading to the late 19th and early 20th centuries to meet the people who actually brought them into the world. Okay, so in Tuareg society, there was this really unique group of artisans called the Inaden. And these weren't just any craftsmen. They made pretty much everything society needed to function. We're talking tools, weapons, jewelry, even parts for tents. These guys were literally the masters of the forge.
But here's where it gets really fascinating. The Inaden lived this life of total contradiction. Think about it. On one hand, they were absolutely indispensable. I mean, society would literally fall apart without them. But on the other hand, they were outsiders. They were marginalized. People saw them as socially separate, almost polluted, by the very work that made them so essential. How wild is that?
And yeah, this went way beyond just making stuff. The Inaden were seen as keepers of secret, powerful knowledge. People believed they had a direct line to these intense subterranean spirits. They were the ones who could deal with the dangerous spirits of the wild. And it was even thought they had the power of an automatic curse. So you can imagine, the spiritual power meant they were both deeply respected and seriously feared. Okay, so remember those smiths, the Inaden, they're the ones who made both the metal bracelets and the wooden tent posts. But, and this is key, these two objects lived in totally different worlds inside Tuareg culture. And those worlds, they were split right down the line by gender. So let's break that down. You've got the metal bracelets, made by men, and they existed out in the public world. They were all about money, commodities, showing off your wealth and status. Then you have the wooden tent posts. These were owned by women, and they belonged to the private, domestic world. Their value wasn't about money, it was symbolic. It was ritual. It was all about protecting the sacred space of the home. So let's zoom in on that bracelet for a second. For a Tuareg noblewoman, this thing was so much more than jewelry. It was basically her resume on her wrist. It showed her identity, her stage in life. It was also her bank account, a literal wearable savings account for the family. And on top of all that, the silver itself was believed to be like a spiritual shield, protecting her from harm.
Okay, now let's flip to the tent post. This is not just a piece of wood holding up a tent. No, no. This was the exclusive property of women, totally central to who they were. These posts created the boundary physically and spiritually between the safe home and the dangerous wild outside. I mean, they were literally the pillars of their world, carved with symbols to guard the family when it mattered most.
So let's just pause for a second. We've got these two objects, just overflowing with life and meaning, right? A bracelet, that's a bank. A tent post, that's a guardian. So what happens when they get yanked out of that world and thrown onto a completely different path? Well, there's a really cool idea from a scholar named Arjun Appadurai that helps us understand this. He talks about the social life of things. It's this idea that objects, just like people, have biographies. They have a life story. They're made, they're used. But then sometimes their path gets totally and sometimes violently diverted. Their story takes a sudden, sharp turn they never saw coming.
And for our bracelet and our tent post, that huge diversion, well, it was the crisis of colonialism. So you have step 1. They're forged by the Inidan with all this deep cultural meaning. Step 2, they live these vibrant lives in Tuareg society. And then step 3, diversion. They were collected. And that single act just ripped them from their world and started this whole new process of turning them into something else entirely, a museum artifact.
And just like that, we're right back where we started, a quiet gallery in Kansas. This is the final stop, or at least the current stop, on their long, complicated journey.
But in this new life, think about everything that gets lost. All that rich, complicated history we just talked about, the spiritual power of the Smiths, the different worlds of men and women, the bracelet as a bank, the post as a protector, all of it just gets flattened, boiled down to a single simple label.
So why does that happen? Well, art historian Sidney Littlefield Casper gives us a clue. For a long time, museums kind of relied on this old anthropological idea of one tribe, one style. It was this approach that basically treated entire cultures as if they were timeless and unchanging, totally uniform. And that way of thinking just erases all the incredible complexity and dynamism we just spent all this time uncovering.
It's like their active social lives have been put on pause. The bracelet isn't a bank anymore. The tent post isn't guarding a home anymore. They went from being active participants in a living culture to being silent, static specimens of one. So, here's my challenge to you. The next time you're in a museum, find an object behind the glass and really look at it. Really look. And don't just read the label. Ask yourself, what was its first life? What happened to divert its path? What incredible stories did it have to leave behind just to end up here, in front of you?